As an Azure administrator, not only is it important to understand the relationship between Azure AD tenants and subscriptions, but it's also important to be able to navigate through them at the command line. Specifically here, we'll be doing that in PowerShell. But before we do that, here in the portal, I'm going to start by searching for the word sub in my search bar at the top. I'm going to click subscriptions. And what this reveals is that for my current active Azure AD tenant, which here is called Azure DevOps, we have one subscription. It's called Pay As You Go, and we've got a subscription ID shown for it. Now, you could have more than one subscription tied to this tenant. It would be shown in this list. You could always add additional subscriptions if required. Different subscriptions would have different features or support available. And so when you deploy resources in the cloud, you can select the appropriate subscription into which to deploy those items. Let's go into Cloud Shell here. Just going to maximize that window. The first thing I'm going to do is use get-command to discover if there are any commandlets related to Azure AD. So maybe I'll put in an asterisk as a wildcard, Azure AD, and asterisk again. So as long as Azure AD is in the name of the commandlet, I'd like to see it. Okay, so we have quite a return list here. So let's see, we can filter that a little bit further. I'm going to clear the screen and use the up arrow key. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the word get in front of our wildcard and Azure AD wildcard. Okay, it's a little bit more streamlined this time. And so as I scroll through this, it looks like we've got quite a few retrieval commandlets related to Azure AD. For example, get-Azure AD current session info. That sounds interesting. Let's run that. Get-Azure AD current session info. Press enter. Now it says, that's great, but before you do that, you need to first connect to Azure AD. So you need to run the connect-Azure AD commandlet first. Now, I don't have to worry about authenticating because I'm already in Cloud Shell in the portal. However, I do need to run that. So connect-Azure AD, and then I use the up arrow key again to run get-Azure AD current session info. And this time we get some return information. So the environment is Azure Cloud. We also have our Azure AD tenant ID, which begins with B1B. Well, if we minimize the Cloud Shell, and back here in the portal, if I were to go into my left-hand navigator and drill down into Azure AD, so we're in Azure DevOps, sure enough, the tenant ID does begin with B1B. Let's jump back into Cloud Shell. Another commandlet that is similar is get-Azure AD tenant detail. So it returns the object ID, in this case the Azure AD tenant ID. We have the display name this time of our Azure AD tenant, Azure DevOps, and then the verified DNS domain suffix. But that's Azure AD stuff. What about the subscription? Well, there are a few things we can do with that. Let's clear the screen. I'm going to run get-command and wildcard, AZ, wildcard, subscription. I'm not sure exactly if those are together or not, but we have a number of commandlets that are returned as a result. One of which is get-AZ subscription. Let's check that one out. Get-AZ subscription. So it returns the name of my subscription, Pay As You Go, and the ID, and the tenant ID to which it is tied. Because remember, a subscription has to be tied to an Azure AD tenant, and it can only be tied to one. So my Pay As You Go subscription ID then begins with 00DA. Let's just go ahead and minimize, and let's check that out back here in the portal. And sure enough, our Pay As You Go subscription does start with 00DA. But let's say that we did have multiple subscriptions here for this Azure AD tenant. How do we switch between them? We can do that with the select-AZ subscription commandlet, where we can specify dash subscription name, and in quotes, we could specify the name of that subscription. So I'll just put in a fake one here because I only have one. And of course, it tells me that that's not a valid tenant or subscription name. Otherwise, it would have switched to it. But what that means then is if I issue commandlets like get-AZ AD user, well, that's tied to my Azure AD tenant. That would give me a list of my user accounts in Azure AD. But if I clear the screen and run commandlets like get-AZ VM to list virtual machines, I get a return list. This is a virtual machine deployed into the current subscription. And remember, we can find that with get-AZ subscription. When you deploy resources, such as virtual machines in the Azure Cloud, you have to deploy them into a specific subscription. Now, I only have one here, so that's an easy choice. But let's say we minimize the Cloud Shell here, and let's say in the portal we said create a resource and we were deploying a virtual machine. Could be deploying anything, but in this case, it's just a VM. Here at the top is where we specify the subscription that we want to deploy it into. If you've got more than one, you have to choose the appropriate subscription. So that's the relevance of that. Now, while we're here in the portal, in the search bar at the top, I'm going to search for the word management, and I'm going to choose management group. In Azure, you have a default management group called the Tenant root group. I've created a management group under it called MG1. At least that's the display name. Its ID is actually MG123456. Anyway, if I expand that, I've moved my Pay-As-You-Go subscription under that management group. The purpose of a management group, and it's really relevant when you have a bunch of subscriptions, not one, but you can move subscriptions and organize them under one or more management groups, which then means that you can apply things like Azure policy at the management group level, and those policy settings would then flow down to all of the subscriptions. Now, if you only have one subscription, it's pointless. You might as well just tie Azure policy, for example, directly to the subscription. But that's the role of management groups, and we can get a little bit of information related to that from PowerShell. So let's go into Cloud Shell and let's figure out how. First thing I'm going to do is run get-AZ management group. It returns the fact that we have our default tenant root group, which you will always have, but it also shows that we've got a display name of MG1 management group 1, and the actual name is MG123456. Well, that's good, but how do I get a list of any child subscriptions within the management group? To do that, I'm going to create a variable called $response, and it's going to store the result of running get-AZ management group. Dash group name is MG123456, and I want to expand and recurse through it to show all children objects. So now if I just type in $response to show what's in that variable, what we're seeing is that we've got a management group called MG123456. The display name is MG1. The parent management group of this one, because you can have a hierarchy, is the tenant root group, and it contains one subscription called Pay As You Go. So as an Azure admin, then it's important to be able to navigate through Azure AD tenants and subscription details using PowerShell. Azure Active Directory or Azure AD tenants are a directory service in the Microsoft Azure Cloud. You can have one or more Azure AD tenants. When you sign up for a Microsoft Azure account initially, you get a default directory. Now, the default DNS domain suffix for your Azure AD tenant always ends in .onmicrosoft.com. You can have multiple Azure AD tenants. For the same types of reasons, you might have more than one Active Directory domain on premises. Those reasons might include having different administrative groups at the IT technical level that need to control their own groups of users and computers and so on. You could then have multiple domains and make sure each administrative group has access to their own domain. Or you might want to have different domains for different business units or different regions around the world. So for the same reasons, you might have multiple Azure AD tenants. Now, we did say that the default DNS suffix is .onmicrosoft.com. You can change that. You can create a custom DNS domain name for a DNS domain that you already own. You can't register brand new DNS domain names through Azure, but you can create a custom DNS domain name in Azure that matches the name of a domain you already own externally, and then you'll be asked to create some DNS records in your DNS zone to prove that you actually do own it and have control of it. So that way, if your company is Quick24x7, you might want your DNS domain suffix to be quick24x7.com instead of .onmicrosoft.com. So Azure AD then is a cloud-based directory service where it can contain user accounts for users to sign in and have access to apps. You can organize users into groups and then assign permissions to groups. You can also register applications in Azure AD to allow users to access them and also to grant permissions to those apps to other resources they might need to talk to. You can also join devices, whether they're mobile devices or laptops, desktops, to your Azure AD tenant for further configuration control, and also to allow users to sign in on those devices with their Azure AD credentials. Pictured on the screen, we have a screenshot of the Azure portal where a technician has clicked the Switch Tenant button within their Azure AD tenant. What that does is it gives you an alphabetical listing of all of the Azure AD tenants tied to this Azure account. In the upper right of the portal, we have our user sign-in name and the current Azure AD tenant, which is shown here as Azure DevOps. But as pictured in the screenshot, there are many additional Azure AD tenants that have been added, perhaps for different business units, different projects, and so on. And so what you can do is you can select one of these Azure AD tenants, and then you can click the Switch button up at the top, which is currently grayed out because nothing's selected, to switch to that Azure AD tenant. Then you could start managing users and groups in that tenant, and if a subscription is tied to that Azure AD tenant, you could start deploying resources like virtual machines, web apps, and so on. Remember, an Azure subscription is associated with an Azure AD tenant. If you have one pay-as-you-go subscription, you can link it to one Azure AD tenant at a time. And you can also move subscriptions between Azure AD tenants as needed. But if you don't have a subscription, when you switch to a different Azure AD tenant, you will be unable to create any resources. So we mentioned that you can move subscriptions between tenants. Here in the portal, I'm looking at the properties of my pay-as-you-go subscription, and the overview blade or page is selected over on the left. There is a change directory button up at the top that has been clicked. And that opens up a new blade or screen on the right where you can select from the drop-down list the Azure AD tenant target that you want to move this subscription to. In Azure AD, you can create user accounts in a multitude of ways. So you can create an Azure AD account manually. They could be invited, which means that they're external users and you're sending an invitation email to them to partake in Azure AD. You could download a CSV or a comma-separated value file for bulk import or bulk invite, where you would put in all of the user details when you have many users that you need to create in Azure AD. Bulk import would be for regular Azure AD users. Bulk invite would be when you have many external users that you want to send an invitation to via email. Azure AD also allows, of course, the creation of groups, where you can have assigned members. That's static group membership, where you manually add members to the group. Or you could have dynamic membership groups, whether it's user or device groups. You can specify attributes in Azure AD. For users, for example, you might look at their manager or their location to determine if they should be a member of a group or not. For devices, you might take a look at the mobile device operating system type to determine if they should be a member of an Android versus an iPhone group, that type of thing. Azure AD is not the same thing as on-premises Active Directory. With an on-premises Microsoft Active Directory domain, you can have organizational units or OUs in your hierarchy, where you can create users and groups, and you can even nest OU levels. And then you can apply group policy settings to OUs. Well, there are no organizational units in Azure AD, and also group policy does not apply in Azure AD. But the closest thing we have to organizational units in Azure AD are administrative units, or AUs. Pictured in the screenshot, we have an administrative unit called AU1. And the users view on the left has been selected, where we can click the add member button at the top to add users to the administrative unit. The purpose is that you organize Azure AD users and groups into an administrative unit, and then you delegate management access for cloud technicians to the administrative unit. That would allow cloud technicians to have limited control to manage only a subset of users and groups, specifically the ones in an administrative unit the technician has been granted permissions to, as opposed to being able to manage all users and groups in the entire Azure AD tenant. So if you're an Active Directory person, it's loosely similar to the delegation of control wizard that you would run in Active Directory. Finally, in Azure AD, we can also create applications. What we're looking at here is the enterprise applications, specifically the all applications view in our Azure AD tenant. So we have a number of apps shown here, like My Custom App, we have some web apps, HackerOne, eBay, and so on. What we can do is assign permissions to users to be able to use these apps. And if the user is signing in, for example, to myapps.microsoft.com, they would have a list of apps shown there that they can launch based on the permissions they have been granted when they sign in with their Azure AD credentials. Azure AD administrators need to have a strong grasp on what an Azure AD tenant is, its relationship to subscriptions, and how that all relates to resources that get deployed in the Azure cloud. To get started here in the Azure portal, I've signed in with my Azure account, and I'm currently connected to my default Azure AD tenant called Azure DevOps. That means that anything I do here, such as if I open up my left-hand navigator and go to Azure Active Directory, I'm placed in my Azure AD tenant, and so when I start to work with users, if I click users on the left, I am viewing existing users in that Azure AD tenant. I can also add new users by clicking the new user button at the top. And if I click the X on the right to close out of that, I could also click on groups to get a list of existing groups in this Azure AD tenant. I could click the new group button in the same way. If I click the X on the upper right, and click on enterprise applications, it's all the same type of thing. I get a list of existing objects of that type, and I can add a new object of that type, of course, given I have admin permissions to the tenant to be able to do that in the first place. I'll click the X to close that. So you could say then that an Azure AD tenant is loosely equivalent to an on-premises Active Directory domain. They're not exactly the same thing. You can't create organizational units and work with group policy in Azure AD, although you can work with administrative units where you could add users and groups, and then control administrative access to that administrative unit containing users and groups. You can join devices to Azure AD. Azure AD is also, if we scroll further down, where you could go into security to specify authentication methods by which users are allowed to authenticate, such as certificates or multi-factor authentication, MFA. You can configure named locations from which users are allowed to authenticate from, and that can also be used in conjunction with conditional access policies, where you can specify one or more conditions that must be satisfied before allowing authentication, perhaps a user coming in from a particular IP address range using an Android device, and signing in with MFA. If all those things check out, and the user has the correct credentials, then they're allowed in. So I'll click the X on the right to close that. If you wanted to enable user self-service password reset, we have a password reset option. All that's tied to the Azure AD tenant. Now, when I'm in my current Azure AD tenant, on the overview blade, or on the left, at the top on the right, I have a Manage Tenants button, which will show me all of the existing Azure AD tenants tied to my Azure AD account. And so you see there's a distinction then between your Azure account and your tenant, and even a subscription. So in order to use Azure, initially you have to sign up with an Azure account. Now, by default, you will have one Azure AD tenant created automatically when you create an account, but you can create additional AD tenants, which we see here for Microsoft Azure. Each of these Azure AD tenants can be associated with one or more subscriptions. Now, I'm still on my Azure DevOps subscription as evidenced in the upper right. And so in the search bar in the center up top, I type sub and click subscriptions. I have one pay-as-you-go subscription associated with this current Azure AD tenant called Azure DevOps. Now, that pay-as-you-go subscription, while it could be switched to a different Azure AD tenant or a different directory, it can't be linked to more than one Azure AD tenant at a time. And this is where I have also the current cost for resources I've deployed in that subscription. You need a subscription to deploy Azure resources. Let's go once again to Azure Active Directory on the left-hand navigator. And let's click Manage Tenants again. I'm going to switch over to a different Azure AD tenant. So I'm going to select Permacan, and I'll click the switch button up at the top. So then I have details about that Azure AD tenant. You click Users on the left to get users in that particular tenant. That's going to be a different list of users than what we saw previously in my Azure DevOps tenant. I'll click the X, and in the same way, if I go to groups and so on, I get a different listing. Also, now that I've switched to the Permacan Azure AD tenant, if I search the search bar at the top for the word sub and click subscriptions, in this particular case, it says you don't have any subscriptions for this particular Azure AD tenant. That means you can't create anything. I could add a subscription. That's about it. If I go home here and I try to click create a resource, let's say Windows Server, well, when I click on that, instead of starting the wizard, which asks me questions about deploying a Windows Server virtual machine, instead, it just says, welcome to Azure, and it gives me options for setting up Azure with subscriptions so I can actually create stuff. So I'm going to click the X over on the right, and I'm going to open up my left-hand navigator again and go down to Azure Active Directory. Azure AD is also the underpinning directory service used by other services like Microsoft 365. So it's not only solely used by Azure. Then when I go back to the Manage Tenants button, this is where I could choose an Azure AD tenant if I no longer needed it, and I could choose Delete. It's going to run a few checks to make sure I can delete this directly, this Azure AD tenant. For example, for users, we have an issue. I have to delete user accounts, I have to delete enterprise applications and Azure subscriptions, and so on. Of course, we also have to have the permission to delete that directory service. In the same way, I'll just click the X. I don't want to do that. I'll go back to Azure Active Directory and Manage Tenants. This is also where I can click the Create button, create a new Azure AD tenant. So whether you are part of a planning or a design team for how Azure will be used, or whether you're an admin that is using something that's already been set up, you have to bear in mind that for future expansion, there might be additional Azure AD tenants. And so understanding the role of the tenant is critical in properly managing Azure services. You can use not only the Azure portal and PowerShell commandlets to navigate through Azure AD tenants and subscriptions, but you can also use the CLI, command line interface. Now you might have downloaded and you might be running the CLI locally on your on-premises computer, or you can run it in the portal through Cloud Shell, which is what I'll do here. So first things first here, in the portal, I'm going to go ahead and click the Cloud Shell icon to start that up, and I'll maximize the Cloud Shell window. The first command I will issue is AZ account show. What this does is it returns the fact that we're in the Azure cloud and we've got a home tenant ID. Now that home tenant ID that starts with B1B represents my Azure AD tenant. We can verify this by minimizing the Cloud Shell, and let's say in the left-hand navigator we went down to Azure Active Directory for our Azure AD tenant. In the overview blade, if we look to the right, our tenant ID indeed starts with B1B. Back here in the Cloud Shell command line window, it also returns an ID that starts with 00DA. That would be the subscription tied to this Azure AD tenant. Let's verify that by minimizing Cloud Shell. I'll search for the word sub for subscriptions here in the top search field, and my subscription, my pay-as-you-go subscription indeed, starts with 00DA. Now remember, you can have more than one subscription tied to this particular Azure AD tenant. It would show up here in the GUI, and back in Cloud Shell, we would also have multiple IDs shown here. Now the is default flag here is set to true, and that's for our Azure AD tenant. That's our default Azure AD tenant. The name of our subscription is pay-as-you-go. It's active or enabled. So that's what we're getting from the AZ account show CLI command. Now the next thing I'll do is clear the screen, and I'm going to run AZ account tenant list. What this is doing is it's showing me some details related to all of my Azure AD tenants. I've got all the tenant IDs that are shown here. So we now know how to get information about the Azure AD tenants here in the CLI. So what we can do now within that context is view AD objects for the current AD tenant. I can do that with AZ AD user list, maybe dash dash query space, open close square brackets dot display name. And remember that display name is lowercase other than the letter N. It's case sensitive. So it's returning a list of user accounts in the current Azure AD tenant. Now what I can do is I can actually log into different Azure AD tenants. For example, AZ login dash dash tenant, and then I'm going to put in the DNS domain suffix for a tenant that I know exists. In this case, permacan.onmicrosoft.com, and I'm going to say dash dash allow dash no dash subscriptions, because I know I do not have a subscription tied to that Azure AD tenant. So then I'm given a message that says, open this URL from Microsoft.com/device login and enter this unique code to authenticate. Okay, I'll do that. So when I enter that URL, I'm going to go ahead and paste it in here, and I'll click next. And I'll specify the account I want to sign in with, and I'll choose continue when it asks, am I trying to use the CLI? Because yes, I am. And then it states that I'm signed in, I can close this window. So I'm going to go ahead and close the window. And back in the Cloud Shell, indeed, I am now connected to my different Azure AD tenant. Now we can verify this in a number of ways. If I clear the screen, and let's say I use the up arrow key to get back to where we're listing user accounts, now we're going to be doing it in the context of the Azure AD tenant that I've just switched to. So I have a different list of user accounts than we did previously. Now because I don't have a subscription tied to this Azure AD tenant, I don't have any resources to display. So if I were to issue commands such as azvm list, I get no detailed listings for virtual machines. I get messages about a subscription because we don't have a subscription tied to this Azure AD tenant. Okay, so now what we're going to do then is switch back to my Azure AD tenant that does have a subscription. We'll try to get a list of VMs and see what's different. Of course, those will be different. So AZ login dash dash tenant. I'll specify the DNS name of my Azure AD tenant, and I'll press enter. And once again, I have to go to the device login page and enter this code. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay, and then I'm signed in. So if I clear the screen and once again run azvm list, because I've got a valid subscription tied to this Azure AD tenant, it then returns virtual machine details. But we can also organize multiple subscriptions under a management group. The benefit of that is that we could do things like apply Azure policy settings to the management group, and those settings would flow down to the subordinate subscriptions under that management group. So I'm going to clear the screen, and I'm going to issue the command AZ account management dash group list. And it returns the default tenant root group, which you will always have, but then I've created a management group with a display name of MG1, which is showing up here. The next thing I like to do is determine if in fact there are any subscriptions subordinate to the MG1 management group. So I'm going to clear the screen. I'm going to run AZ account management dash group, but this time show, not list, dash dash name. The management group is actually called MG123456. MG1 was just the display name. And then I'm going to run dash dash expand, and I'm going to press enter. Okay, so what I've got in my output here is the fact that I've got a child subscription. It's my pay-as-you-go subscription. I also have the subscription ID. Now that is in my MG1 management group, whose parent is the tenant root group. So there's a lot we can learn then in the CLI about Azure AD tenants and subscriptions. In this demonstration, I'm going to use PowerShell to navigate Azure AD. Now, as we know, Azure AD, Azure Active Directory, is a cloud-based directory service where we can create user accounts and organize them into groups. We can register applications. We can create administrative units that have users and groups within them to control their management. But it's not quite the same thing as on-premises Active Directory, because in the Azure cloud, Azure AD cannot have OUs, organizational units. There's no concept of group policy the way that we have on premises, so it is different. But we can manage and navigate through Azure AD with the GUI, with the CLI, and what we're going to do with PowerShell. Now here in the GUI, in the portal, in the left-hand navigator, I can open that up and drill all the way down on the left to Azure Active Directory, which allows me to connect to my current active Azure AD tenant, which is also reflected in the upper right where I can work with users, and I can go back and I can work with groups. And of course, if I go back to my Azure AD tenant in the overview page or blade over on the right, I have a Manage Tenants button, which alphabetizes all of the Azure AD tenants. And I could select one, for example, to switch to it, which means I would then be working with the users and groups and registered apps and so on within that Azure AD tenant. However, let's go ahead and fire up the Cloud Shell here, and let's maximize that window. So the first thing I want to do is do some discovery. I'm going to run git-command * Azure AD *, so wildcard. And that will reveal to us a list of PowerShell commandlets that contain Azure AD in their name, such as git-Azure AD current session info. Also, if I run git-command, I could also use a wildcard and just look for AZ-AD. So instead of spelling out Azure, just AZ. These are the newer version of the commandlets than the older Azure spelled out version of the commandlets. For example, we don't have a current session info type of commandlet with AZ-AD. So let's start working with some of these. Clear screen with CLS. I'm going to run git-Azure AD current session info. It tells me that I need to run connect-Azure AD first. Okay, so let's go ahead and type that in and press enter. Now I'll use the up arrow key to go back to what we were trying to do, and it returns back that we are in the Azure cloud. We've got our Azure AD tenant ID and the DNS domain name, our tenant domain DNS suffix. Another similar commandlet is git-Azure AD tenant detail, where the object ID column is representing the unique ID of my Azure AD tenant. And again, we have the display name of it, it's called Azure DevOps, and the verified DNS domain name for that tenant. When you clear the screen, yet again, we're going to run git command. We're going to take a look for any commandlets that have the word tenant in their name. Okay, so there's some interesting stuff here, such as get-az tenant. Let's take a look at that. Get-az tenant. What this is doing is returning all of the Azure AD tenants tied to this Azure account. The one we're currently working with is called Azure DevOps, but we get not only the name, the display name of it, but also the unique ID for the tenant and the DNS domain suffix used by those particular Azure AD tenants. Now, at any time, we can run get-az context to see what we are connected to. We're connected to our pay-as-you-go subscription with a tenant ID beginning with B1B. And again, if we go back to our get-az tenant, B1B is our Azure DevOps Azure AD tenant. That means anything that we enter in, like get-az AD user, is in the context of the Azure AD tenant we're connected to. So notice I have quite a list of users here. But we could switch to a different Azure AD tenant. Let's once again run get-az tenant. I want to switch to, let's say, the Permacan Azure AD tenant. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight and copy the tenant ID. And I'll clear the screen with CLS. Now I'm going to use connect-az account-tenant, and I've pasted in the tenant ID that I just copied, and I'm going to use -use device authentication as the last parameter, and I'll press enter. So it's instructing me to go to a specific URL, enter the code provided here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy the code, and I'm going to go to that site. I'll then be prompted to enter the code, so I'll go ahead and do that. Click next. Choose the user I want to sign in as. That's the user I'm already signed in as. It asks, so you're trying to sign into PowerShell? Yes, so I'm going to click on continue. It says that I'm signed in. I can close this window. Okay. So it reports back here in Cloud Shell that I'm now connected to that tenant ID. We can verify this with get-az context. Okay, looks like we've now switched to a different Azure AD tenant, which means then I should be able to run get-az AD user and get a different list of users for the tenant I'm currently connected to. And indeed, we have a much smaller list of users this time. The same thing goes for any other commands related to Azure AD, like get-az group to list groups that I might have defined in Azure AD. Well, that's only going to show me the groups for the tenant I am currently connected to. And again, if we run get-az context, that tenant starts with C76C. We run get-az tenant. C76C is for the Permacan Azure AD environment. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground regarding Azure AD tenants and the relationship to subscriptions and creating resources and so on. What I'd like to do in this case is create an Azure AD tenant. Now that's kind of like creating a new on-premises Active Directory domain, at least in a general sense. You might want a separate administrative unit. For example, I have a different team in the western part of a country, and they're going to take care of their own Azure AD services, and so we might want to have our own Azure AD tenant for the western region, let's say, which has its own set of users and groups and enterprise applications and so on. Or maybe a large organization has subsidiary companies that it owns, and each of those might have their own Azure AD tenant. And that's going to be the take for our example here. So to get started, I'm already signed into my Azure account, and we know that when you create an Azure account, you get a default Azure AD tenant. But I want to create an additional one. One way to do this is in my left-hand navigator here in the portal, to go down to Azure Active Directory. That puts me in the overview blade for my current Azure AD tenant. And from here, I could click the Manage Tenants button. This shows me an alphabetical list of existing Azure AD tenants. But what I want to do is click the Create button. So the tenant type here is defaulted to Azure Active Directory. Now that's normally what you will do if you want to have an Azure AD tenant to manage user accounts and groups for your organization. But another way to view this is if you want to use an Azure AD tenant for external users. For example, maybe you want to have a web application for whatever product or service your company deals with, where customers can register with their own account. And you might have hundreds of thousands, even hundreds of millions of them. Or a government agency might want to have an Azure AD tenant to store citizen account information so they can sign in for various government-related services. That's where Azure Active Directory B2C would come in. So in this case, I'm going to stick with Azure Active Directory. I'll click Next for configuration. For the organization name, I'm going to call this Quick 24x7 Test. For the initial domain name, it's going to be Quick 24x7 Test. And then it's going to add the .onmicrosoft.com DNS suffix by default. Of course, I can change that after the fact by creating a custom DNS domain name for my Azure AD tenant. I'll leave the country to United States, so that's the data center location. Depending on the nature of your organization and any applicable laws and regulations, especially for data privacy, you may have to select a different appropriate country or region to host your Azure AD tenant. But in this case, I'll leave it on the United States. I'll click Next for review and create. Now, if the validation fails, it's because something hasn't passed one of the checks. And in this case, if I click Previous, it's because that name is not unique. The initial domain name is not unique. So if I would put in characters to make it unique, and then click Next, Review, and Create, the validation will pass. After which, I can then click Create to actually create this Azure AD tenant. So it's got screen captcha where I have to specify the items that I see, approve I'm not a robot. I'll go ahead and do that and click Submit. It then states that the tenant creation is in progress and it can take a few minutes. So we're just going to bide our time and wait for that to happen. And after a few minutes, we get a message stating that the tenant creation was successful. And we have a link to click here to navigate to our new tenant. Of course, we could always do it the other way, which means we could click on Azure Active Directory in our left-hand navigator, and then I'll click OK. And if I go to Manage Tenants, In my alphabetical listing, we now have quick 24x7 test along with the DNS domain name, of course, which ends with .onmicrosoft.com. So I can select that tenant and I could choose the switch button again to switch to the tenant. Another way to switch between Azure AD tenants when you're signed into your Azure account is in the upper right where your account info is to click up there and choose switch directory. Now with our new Azure AD tenant, if I click users on the left, I've only got the user that was signed into created shown as a valid user account. If I click the X on the upper right, if I go to groups, there are no groups by default. I'll click the X again. In the left-hand navigator, I can also scroll down and choose custom domain names. This is where I can add a custom domain name that might reflect the actual DNS name on the internet for this organization. An example of that might be quick24x7test72.com instead of .onmicrosoft.com. Now that I've switched to this new Azure AD tenant, up in the top search bar in the portal, if I search for sub for subscriptions and then click on subscriptions, any existing subscriptions will be shown. Now, of course, it's a brand new Azure AD tenant, and so we don't have any subscriptions, which means we can't create anything, can't create any resources in the cloud. But I could click the add button to go ahead and add a subscription. For example, if I've never signed up for a free trial, then I could do that. I could click the link to view my eligible offers. But what's also interesting is that if I were to open up my left-hand navigator again and switch back to my default tenant, so I'm going to click Manage Tenants, my default tenant is shown here as Azure DevOps, so I'll select that and switch to it. Now, if I look at the subscriptions for this Azure AD tenant, I have a pay-as-you-go subscription, which I could click on, and in its properties in the overview blade, I have the option to change directory. Okay, so if I were to click on that from the drop-down list, I could choose quick 24x7 test, that's the new AD tenant we just made here in Azure, and I could turn on the check mark to basically say that any role assignments with RBAC, with role-based access control, any managed identities, those will not be transferred over. But what I could do is link my subscription to this new Azure AD tenant instead of the one it's currently linked to. A subscription can never be tied to more than one Azure AD tenant at a time. It's one only. But any other resources like virtual machines and storage accounts and so on would remain intact. I'm not going to do this, but we could move the subscription to another Azure AD tenant, and understanding that relationship is absolutely crucial as an Azure administrator. In this demonstration, I'm going to create and configure an administrative unit. Now, in the Azure AD Cloud, an administrative unit is tied to Azure Active Directory. Let's start here in the portal by opening up our left-hand navigator menu and then drilling down to Azure Active Directory so we can kind of look at what we are about to talk about in detail. Here in the left-hand navigator, within Azure AD, I'm going to click Administrative Units. So you can have multiple administrative units. Here we don't have any, but what exactly is it? Think of administrative unit as being like a container that will contain users and groups, and those would be Azure AD users and groups, that you would organize into the administrative unit. Now, the purpose of doing that is you can then delegate other admin access to manage those users and groups in that administrative unit. So if you've got experience working with on-premises Active Directory, you might be familiar with the notion of delegated access to an OU, where admins have access to manage objects only within that OU. That's kind of like what this is. It's delegated access for admins so they can only manage users and groups within a specific administrative unit. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with this then. I'm going to click the Add button to add a new administrative unit, and I'm going to call it AU1 for Administrative Unit 1. You can also enter in an optional description. I'm going to click Next to assign roles. Now, these roles are not for the members of the administrative unit. Rather, these are the roles that you want to delegate to other admins so they can manage the users and groups that ultimately will exist within this administrative unit. For example, if I were to select Password Administrator, on the right, it then asks me to add an assignment. Who should have the ability to administer passwords for users that eventually will exist in this administrative unit? So let's say I'm going to give that permission to Cody Blackwell. Cody Blackwell is a cloud admin and should be able to reset user passwords within this AU, this administrative unit. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click on the Add button to do that. Notice that the Assign column now reflects a value of 1 for the Password Administrator role, whereas the other roles have a value of 0 because they haven't been assigned. And you can change this after the fact, as you might have guessed. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next, Review and Create. Notice that during this creation process, we do not specify the members of the administrative unit in terms of the users or groups. So I'm going to go ahead and click Create. And we get notification messages that all of this succeeded. Okay, well, that's lovely. Now we have AU1 showing up in our list of administrative units. And if I click on it to open up its properties, if I click Roles and Administrators on the left, and if I click on Password Administrator, for the assignments, we've got user Cody Blackwell showing here. If I were to click Role Settings, we've got options here such as under Assignment, whether or not this should be allowed to be a permanent active assignment. It's set to a value of yes. So if we want to, we can configure and tweak some of these details. However, I'm going to click the X in the upper right. Now that's roles and administrators within this administrative unit. But we also have the option of going to groups and also users. Let's start with users. If I click on users, I can click Add Member. So let's say I'm going to add user Janice Carter. This is an existing Azure AD user that will be a member of this administrative unit. She's not an administrator. She is a user that is a member of this administrative unit. So therefore, based on our current configuration, Cody Blackwell should be able to reset her password, but nobody else is in Azure AD. I'll just click Select, and Janice Carter is successfully added as a member. Now I can also do the same type of thing with groups. Maybe I want to add groups instead of individual users. So I could click the Add button, and from here I could select groups. These are groups that already exist in Azure AD. I'll click Select, and I might have to click Refresh and wait a few moments before the group shows up in the list. Okay, so how do we test this out? Well, to test this, what I will do is I'm going to sign into the Azure portal as Cody Blackwell to ensure that he could change the password for Janice Carter, but is unable to do it for other Azure AD users. Now, of course, I have to make sure I select a user that is not in any groups that were also added to that administrative unit. Okay, so now signed into the portal as user C Blackwell. That's Cody Blackwell. So what I want to do then is go into Azure Active Directory as Cody Blackwell and go to my list of users. For example, I'm going to select a user such as Lucas Brenner and make sure I know what groups he is a member of. So he is not a member of any groups that were added to that administrative unit. So therefore, if I go back to the profile page or blade here for Lucas Brenner and click Reset Password, it says the password can't be reset because there's an incorrect level of administrative privilege. Okay, that makes sense for Cody Blackwell. However, what happens, I wonder if we try to do that for Janice Carter, we're logged in as Cody Blackwell. Let's try it. So if I open up Janice Carter and click Reset Password, it gives me the option to reset it because Cody Blackwell has the password administrator role for an administrative unit that Janice Carter is a member of. Now back in my first web browser window where I'm signed in as an IT admin for the cloud, if I go into my search bar at the top of the portal and search for sub and then open up subscriptions, let's say, and click on my subscription, if I were to, let's say, attempt to make a role-based access control or RBAC assignment for password admin, it would look different. So if I click access control IAM, click add on the right and then add role assignment, in the list of roles here at the subscription level, if I search for password, it doesn't show up. So the point is that that role is specifically designed to be used within Azure AD, whereas the role assignment area that we're looking at here allows for the management of cloud resources in the Azure environment. In this demonstration, I'm going to register a custom DNS domain name for my Azure AD tenant. Now, when you create a new Azure AD tenant, or if you stick with the default one that you get when you sign up with your account, you have a default DNS domain suffix that makes up part of the user login or the user principal name, the UPN. Let's explore this. So here in the portal, what I'm going to do is open up my left-hand navigator, and I'm going to go down to Azure Active Directory. I'm in my default directory, but of course I could switch to whichever Azure AD tenant I want to create the custom domain name for by going to Manage Tenants and then selecting the appropriate tenant and then switching over to it. So in this case, I have another Azure AD tenant called Quick24x7, and it's using the .onmicrosoft.com DNS suffix. That is a default when you first create an Azure AD tenant. But the point is that you can change it to a different DNS name, and that's why we are here. So I'm going to go ahead and select that Quick24x7 tenant, and I'm going to choose Switch. Now, the next thing I want to do now that I'm in the correct Azure AD tenant is go all the way down in the left-hand navigator to Custom Domain Names. That's where I'm going to see the current domain names, of which there could be more than one. So we've got a name shown here with .onmicrosoft.com. But what I want to do is add a new custom domain. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And I'm going to put in quick24x7test.info. Now, the idea is that might be a public DNS domain name, so it's a public identity for the organization, and that's what I want to use for Azure AD. So when users sign in, after the @ symbol, which is part of their email address, their user principal name, we'll have quick24x7test.info. So I'm going to go ahead and click Add Domain. Now, at this point, it says the domain name was added, but you need to prove that you actually own that. You see, you have to have that DNS domain name registered already with the DNS registrar. Now, that is outside of Azure. I actually do own that DNS domain already. So down below, it's saying, okay, to prove that you own that DNS domain, you need to go into it and add a zone record, for example, a TXT record, with the following details as shown below. And it says verification will not succeed until you've done this and it's up to date. And it's checked by us clicking the verify button here. Okay, so here in another browser window, I've signed into my GoDaddy account. There are many different DNS registrars out there. I happen to have selected GoDaddy. So here's my domain, quick24x7test.info. I'm going to click on it to open it up, and then I'm going to scroll down until I get to the point where I can manage DNS. Because what happens at this point is I can then manage the zone records. We have DNS records here, A records, name server records, CNAME alias records, start of authority records. But what I want to do is I want to add a new record. So I'm going to click the add button towards the upper right. The type is going to be TXT. Now back here in the portal, the alias or hostname is just an @ symbol, but the destination or points to address, the value of the record, I'm going to go ahead and copy that. So back here in GoDaddy, in the creation of the record, I'm going to fill in the appropriate name and value, and I'll use the default time to deliver TTL, and I will add the record to my zone. Now remember, the difference between a DNS domain name and a DNS zone is that the domain name is just a name, it's a text string. The zone is what we're actually working in here. It's a scope of authority where we can manage the records related to that DNS domain name. So there's a TXT record at the bottom. So us having the ability to add that record with those details proves that we own this DNS domain name. But let's go back here into the portal to verify it. Now sometimes when you click verify, it won't work right away. It might take time. Let's see what happens here. Okay, looks like we're in luck here. It happened pretty much immediately. The domain name has been verified, which means that we can start using it. Now what does that mean? Let's go back to our Azure AD tenant here in breadcrumb trail on the upper left. Let's get a list of users. So if I go to users, I've got one user here, and if I click on that user account, what's after the @ symbol is the original DNS domain name for my Azure AD tenant, which ends with .onmicrosoft.com. Okay, that's fine. Let's click the X. So if I were to create a new Azure AD user, I'll click the new user button at the top. When I specify the username, such as M Bishop, after the @ symbol, I can select either the original DNS domain name for my tenant, which ends with .onmicrosoft.com, or because we verified this custom DNS domain name, I could select the new DNS domain name. So this, along with what's before the @ symbol, comprises the user principal name, or the user sign-in name, the user email address, whatever you would like to refer to it as. So let's just go ahead and continue creating this user just for good measure. I'll just accept a lot of the defaults. I've just filled in the name, and I'll click Create. So at this point, we've now got our new user created, and notice in the user principal name column, it reflects our new custom DNS domain name. The other thing to think about here, and let's go back to our Azure AD tenant, the breadcrumb trail in the upper left, is that if I go down to the left-hand navigator for my tenant and go down to Azure AD Connect, this is where we could download the Azure AD Connect agent. That's a piece of software you can run on an on-premises Active Directory domain controller. Now you might do that because you want to link your on-premises Active Directory here in the cloud to Azure AD. In order to do that, you've got to have a custom DNS name that matches your on-premises Active Directory domain name. So that would be another reason to come in here and do what we've just gone through. We'll take a look at Azure AD Connect in a different example later. One of the reasons that we create Azure AD user accounts is so that those users have their own unique identity that they can sign in with, and then they can gain access to apps, whether they be on-premises or cloud-based. So here in the portal, let's start in the left-hand navigator by going down into Azure Active Directory and clicking on Users to view users that might already exist. So we've got a number of users that exist in Azure AD. Now, of course, we could also add new Azure AD users by clicking the New User button. We could invite external users with an email message by clicking New Guest User. And if we have a lot of users to add, whether it's Azure AD or external, we could go into bulk operations and do a bulk create or a bulk invite. However, we're going to do here is click the X in the upper right. We already have a bunch of users, and I'm going to click Enterprise Applications over on the left. Now I'll get a list of any existing enterprise applications. And what I could do is I could set the permissions for users to be able to access these apps. For example, we've got eBay listed here. Well, if I click on eBay, it pops up with the properties for it, where I could go to users and groups over on the left, and I could click Add User or Group to allow permissions to access the app. I have a message that says because of my current Active Directory plan level, which is tied to my subscription and any product licenses, then I can only assign individual users. Not a problem. I'll click None Selected under Users, and I'll search for user, in this case, Lucas Brenner, and I'll make sure that that account has access to this eBay app. And then I'll click Assign. But what about if we don't already have an enterprise app in the list? Could we add one? And we certainly can. So let's click the X to close out of that enterprise app, and I'm going to click New Application. Now this allows me to browse the Azure AD gallery where I have numerous apps that we could add. Now if you were to configure what's called the Azure AD Application Proxy, you could also enable these cloud Azure AD accounts to access on-premises applications. However, I can also search for apps. For example, if I search for the word expense, then I have a number of apps shown in the list that I could select from. Now many of these apps, of course, will require you to have a subscription for that particular app in order to have user accounts that can access the functionality of that app. Let's say we do have that configured for the Travel and Expense Management tool. Now when I click on that, it allows me to sign up for Travel and Expense Management. And when I click that link, it opens up a new web browser window where I would sign in with an existing account for that particular app, or I could choose sign in with Microsoft. However, I'm just going to click to close that browser window. Now let's say I search for the word hacker. Here I've got an app called HackerOne, which allows me to make a connection with penetration testers and cybersecurity experts. So if I were to click on that one, it doesn't require me to actually sign up with an account. However, there is a link to read the step-by-step HackerOne integration tutorial. So if I click that, and this would be something that would be important when you initially add an app, because some of the steps can vary from one app to another. We've got the steps here listed in the Microsoft documentation for integrating things like single sign-on or SSO with this particular app. But at this level, all we're going to do is create the app in Azure AD, because by doing that, we can then control permissions to it. And we're going to sign in with Lucas Brenner's account, so I'll go ahead and click next. And then we'll enter his password, and then we'll sign in. So we've signed in here as evidenced in the upper right as user Lucas Brenner. And Lucas Brenner, on the apps page, has access to eBay as well as to HackerOne because we have added him with permissions to those apps through Azure AD. Back here in the Azure portal, if I were to still work in the Azure DevOps Azure AD tenant, go back down my enterprise applications, let's say I go into HackerOne, let's say I would remove Lucas Brenner's permissions. So I'll go to users and groups, I'll select Lucas Brenner, and I'll remove him. So how long does that take to come into effect? Well, back here as Lucas Brenner on the myapps.microsoft.com web portal page, if we do a refresh, the application should disappear. Now, it might not always be that quick and that immediate, but the point is that there are no additional steps that must be undertaken in order for that app to be removed from the user. Now remember that you can also use group assignments for app permissions if your Active Directory plan allows, which means a user might need to be a member of a specific group in order to gain access to the app. So here on the myapps.microsoft.com page, still signed in as Lucas Brenner, we could go to My Apps in the upper left and we could choose My Groups. Now that will give us a couple of options. On the left, we've got a heading called Groups I Own. So if Lucas Brenner has been designated as a group owner so we can manage the group, they would show up over here on the left. There's also a Create Group option, but then there's Groups I'm in over on the right. And this is where a user like Lucas Brenner could choose Join Group and then be presented with a list of Azure AD groups. Let's say Group 1X. And if that group has been configured to allow users to request membership, this one does not, as indicated on the right, then Lucas Brenner would be able to go through with that procedure, and if that group has access to additional apps, they would magically show up after the page is refreshed. So there are a few ways then to deal with enterprise application permissions through Azure AD. So in this course, we've examined how to manage Azure AD subscriptions, tenants, administrative units, custom domain names, and applications. We did this by exploring the Azure portal, CLI and PowerShell with Azure Subscriptions and Azure AD. We created and managed an Azure AD tenant and enabled an Azure AD custom DNS domain name, and we managed Azure AD applications. In our next course, we'll move on to explore how to manage Azure AD users, groups, devices, apps, and licenses.